Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Mastering Project Readiness, How to Ensure a Project Will Be Successful. My name is Terry Takai, and I'm a Senior Vice President with the Center for Digital Government. So excited to be with you today as the host for today's webcast. Thanks for joining us. You're in for a great session over the next 30 minutes. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Now, I know everybody's been in these virtual environments. But I just also want to let you know, during today's webcast, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. For those of you on Twitter, use hashtag GovTechLive to share key takeaways, quotes, and learnings from today's webcast. All right, well, let's get started. I am so excited to introduce my two speakers today. I've got Russ Nichols. And Russ is the acting state CIO and the acting director of the California Department of Technology. In February 2021, Governor Gavin Newsom appointed Russ as the deputy state CIO and as the chief deputy director for the California Department of Technology. During his 30-plus year career, Russ has served as director of the Division of Enterprise Information Services at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and as the acting director and as the project director of the Strategic Offender Management System. He's going to tell you a lot more about that huge project for the state of California. His career has included work in the Office of the California Correctional Healthcare Services, the California State Controller's Office, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the Employee Development Department. All huge departments in the state of California. He began his state tenure as a programmer in 1990, and the California Public Sector CIO Academy named Russ Chief Information Officer of the Year in 2018. My next speaker is David Morris. David is the founder and CEO of Hyper Solutions. David has spent his career researching and empowering leaders to transform their teams, their companies, and their careers. His passion is to identify high-impact performers, hypers, and help them reach greater success through a hybrid of technology-driven platforms and experience-based advisory. In founding Hyper Solutions, David turned his passion into a product that helps executive sponsors de-risk large-scale efforts. His recent clients have included E-Trade, DirecTV, Subway Restaurants, Western Digital, Wendy's, On Semiconductor, CBRE, YPO, and many others. Previously, David co-founded Seedling Group, a Boston-based retained executive search firm, serving startups, publicly traded companies, and private equity firms. He also helped launch the San Francisco office as director of the corporate executive board that is now with Gartner. David graduated from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. All right, well, let's get started. Now, we all know that these change efforts that are going on in government today are really a vital part of making government more effective and efficient for our constituents. Major projects are including digital transformation, IT modernization, and hybrid workflow redesign. And that's really shaping the way that government services constituents and businesses. But as we all know, too often projects have come in late or over budget or really fail completely. According to a 2017 report from the Project Management Institute, 31% of IT projects failed to meet their goals. And I'm sure many of you have unfortunately experienced some of those projects in your careers. 43% exceeded their initial budgets and 49% were late. And really the more challenging is another 14% fail completely. Now with smarter project management on the front end, we believe that really agencies and departments can vastly improve the success rate of new projects, something that will be especially important as state and local governments make use of stimulus funds from the American Rescue Plan and the federal infrastructure bill. And of course, we're also seeing that budgets in state and local government for technology are also seeing stability in 2022, and we think that will continue into 2023. So the number of projects that CIOs are facing and the CIO teams are facing is really very important in these next 2 years. So Russ, I mean, with your history in actually being able to manage large projects, you had such a successful career. And we all know that, as I always love to say, a small project in California is a big project. So what have you found in your career that's really essential to project success?
Thanks, Terry. As we talk about projects, we can come to the cliche of you have to know what the outcome is or what defines success. But way too often, we overlook the people that are accountable for that success, and having the right team together, having the right focus, and especially the right leadership in place up into the executive ranks is one of the critical things that is very often overlooked when we assign people based on org charts rather than actual capabilities and interest in the project.
Fantastic, Russ. And you have built such amazing relationships, with the business leaders, if you will, in the agencies. That's a very critical factor. And David, I want you to weigh in on that. You've worked not only on government projects, but also with private sector companies to help guide them on successful projects. What's a common theme that really runs across all of these projects?
Thank you, Terry. To build on what Russ just shared, overwhelmingly, both in private and public sector, we have found that the right executive sponsor combined with the right project director, really the dynamic duo of those individuals, seems to be behind the successes. And whenever we see a failure, there seems to be some type of weak link on that. And, Russ, really love to get some of your thoughts on executive sponsorship. And, when did it become clear to you that executive sponsorship was important?
So it's funny. It's one of those things that I didn't even realize that I didn't have until I actually had a really effective and empowering executive sponsor. And so it was an epiphany almost after the fact when I worked with someone who was not so much a boss or in a reporting relationship, but a partner. They were engaged enough in the project that it wasn't me providing status, but it was an actual conversation about how we wanted to direct things, how we wanted to handle problems, not just reporting, the typical milestones or metrics, scope, schedule, and resources and things along those lines, but actually getting into what is it that we're trying to accomplish and really having substantive conversations about what needs to be adjusted. And sometimes what we thought we wanted to accomplish is not really the outcome that we're looking for. And you peel that onion as you go through the project, but that only happens if you've got that strong conversational relationship between the project director and the sponsor. And you're not just looking at the black and white on a piece of paper that, 2 years ago we said these are the outcomes or these are the constraints. Those things might have been good for about an hour when you wrote it, but the reality is in a project, they're always maturing and changing a little bit. And that group or that duo really is responsible for having that conversation and constantly adjusting course and adjusting methods to make sure that we're getting to those outcomes.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you and I have compared stories over the years and was trying to understand even what is an executive sponsor, which we'll get into in a moment. One of the ways we discovered it with a very large private sector client is a CIO was in conversation with me, had a multi-$100 million digital transformation. And he said that although he spent most of the money, there's not really been a deliverable. He went on to say he didn't know if the problem was himself, the team, or something else. And so we went in there with a lot of curiosity to unpack. We met with the system integrator, we met with the team, we met with the stakeholders, we met with him. And what we ultimately found is they were actually all fine. There was nothing wrong. What was missing was an owner. they all seem to sort of be looking up to the C-suite and wondering who really owned the outcome, who was setting the direction. And that's when the term executive sponsor came up. And I think I brought that back to you. And I said, Russ, how do you define what an executive sponsor is? Maybe you can share that a little bit. What exactly an executive sponsor is in your mind?
So quite often it comes back, and I mentioned org chart earlier, a lot of times we assign it because they're in the right positional authority. And we really are talking about projects that are big enough and transformational in whatever organization, whether it's a government organization, private organization, doesn't really matter. It's projects that are important. You do have to have that positional authority, but you really have to have that engagement and that investment in the project itself and be willing, and I say it, you have to be willing to bet your career on the outcome. And for both the project director and the project sponsor, you really want folks that are into the business that you're trying to address, that really can talk about not just the technology that we're using to do it, but what does it mean to be successful in the outcome that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to impact people's lives? Are you trying to, change processes for economic impact or something along those lines? But constantly focused on that outcome and having that conversation, and really in touch with how we're doing in accomplishing that, and being willing to, frankly, sometimes say we're going about it wrong, and not just pushing ahead because we've got a plan or a consultant that tells us this is what needs to be done, but almost that sixth sense of, are we doing the right thing, and are we doing it the right way to get to the outcome that we need?
Okay, so in the spirit of that, going back to your point about, let's just assume it's transformational for the organization. Let's assume it's a very large transformation. You need the positional authority. So let's say by default, it's the director of the department, or it's the CEO of the organization, just by default, because they have positional authority. If they don't have that passion that you just mentioned and that commitment, okay, what should they do?
Well, if they don't have that passion or commitment, or frankly, the time to invest, that's when they need to find the person in the organizational structure that does, that is willing to dedicate that as a career step, as really investing. But the second piece of that is that person's got to be empowered. If they are just a stand-in, someone acting for me, but they've got to come back and ask for my permission on things, that's not setting it up for success. That's just creating more bureaucracy. So
tactically, from an authority standpoint, what level of authority are we talking? I mean, is it 100% authority that the head of the organization needs to give to that person if they're going to be full executive sponsor?
I don't know that I would say it's 100% authority, but it is 100% accountability. And the reason I make a distinction between those two is there will always be, somewhere, it could be a CFO, it could be a board of directors, somewhere where you have to go back and really have the business proposal that says, this is what I'm trying to do, and the constraints in which I'm trying to do it, which could be funding or people or legislative boundaries or something along those lines. So you do have those boundaries on the sandbox that you have to work within. And so there will often be somebody that you have to go back and say, this is what we're doing, and get clearance. And it could be a legal type of boundary. But you have to have really 100% investment and provide what we call air cover to that person. In other words, I trust them. I trust their decision-making process. I trust them to accomplish that goal and to find the best way to do it. I'm not going to second guess them. I'm not going to come back and say, well, that was an interesting approach, but I need you to do it this way because of politics or because it's the way I would do it. If you're going to delegate that down to a different project sponsor and then the next step down to a project director, you have got to innately trust them to be successful and let them run. It's kind of like having kids and they've grown up to the point that you're turning them loose and letting them run life. You're letting your sponsor and your project director take a very transformational and important element of your business. Again, government or private sector, doesn't matter. Develop this line of business, create an outcome that adds value for the consumers of whatever that business is. And if they can't do that, it is a very big negative impact on the entire organization. So you're really investing in people that are choosing or charting your destiny for the next 4 or 5 years or potentially even decades, depending on the type of system.
Okay, so the executive sponsor by default is either going to be the head of the organization or someone they appoint. They're going to have 100% accountability, full accountability in the end, not all the authority because it may be split across certain governance structures. Okay, and now you have this executive sponsor. The executive sponsor now chooses a project director. Well, what is the difference between an executive sponsor and a project director? How do you distinguish them?
So the project director, I describe it in simple terms. We can often say you need somebody that is certified in project management and all kinds of things. And there are a whole bunch of people out there that are well skilled in the technical tools. But often that leads you to well-documented failures rather than well-executed successes. And it's not because the tools are bad, but when we focus on the tool and the application of process and leave behind the thought of what we're trying to accomplish and the humanistic side of how we get there, you can execute the process perfectly, but it doesn't move you forward. And so choosing that project director is not so much about looking at somebody's pedigree or their experience using a tool set or their certifications, but that relationship between the project sponsor and the project director, and really that engagement together, that co-ownership of the outcome. And the project director is really tasked with identifying where they are, what is a successful outcome, and overcoming every obstacle between those two. And what that person really needs is the hunger to overcome obstacles that they don't own, that they don't have the positional authority to address. They've got to find ways to knock out every one of those obstacles, to reach out to people that they need their support from, that whether it's as small as a budget augmentation or as big, as a policy or statute change. If that is an obstacle that's standing between you and the end, you can't just admire the problem. Your job is to go eat that problem for lunch. Go find a way to address that problem. Go around it, go through it, go over it, doesn't matter. Find a way to make that no longer a problem between you and the outcome. And way too often, we have really good technical people that will raise it as an issue and then wait for somebody else to come solve it. And the project director cannot do that. Project director has got to get that to the sponsor, the two of them together. If it's significant enough, have to figure out how they're going to overcome it, which could be a change in scope. It could be a change in outcome. Sometimes it's just finding a mechanism to actually make the problem go away. But they can't just admire the problem. It's got to be put to bed.
You led one of the most successful projects in the state of California back at Department of Corrections. It was a $500 million or so program in the end. And you discovered the importance of an executive sponsor during the course. What did that relationship look like between you as the project director and the executive sponsor?
It was not an IT versus business type of relationship. For me, what worked was really immersing myself in the business, in that case of corrections, and being able to have conversations with the secretary of the organization, the leader of one of the largest correctional organizations in the world. What is the outcome, and what does it mean to be successful, and how are we trying to use technology to get there? But frankly, in the course of the project, there were a lot of things that weren't the technology project. It was more about retraining staff and making staff feel safe with the transformation we were introducing into the organization. Not just the use of a tool, but how do we prepare the staff that operate those correctional institutions, in this case, to really change the way they do business, the way they interact with the offender population that's in that custodial environment. All of those things had to come together to get to successful outcomes. The technology was just a piece of it. So that relationship that I had in this case with the sponsor and the executives of the organization was much broader than just implementing technology or even doing business process reviews. It really was being a part of the heart of the organization and helping to make policy calls and informing the executives so that they could take things, whether it's legislative proposals in our case or things to the administration. How do we want to do things differently? How do we want to approach problems using technology in this project as a catalyst, but as the springboard into bigger things beyond just the implementation of the tool?
And then you got rewarded with the promotion where you now became the executive sponsor and you got to go recruit a project director. What were some of the traits you looked for in the project director, and how did you have to change a role? It's like in Hollywood, you went from being the director of the production to the producer. And so what did that mean? How did you have to shift?
Well, it's a hard shift, and that happens, I think, to a lot of people. And when you move on, one of the things that I find that's important is not to find a clone of me, not to find somebody that does it the way I would do it, but really somebody who's a complement to me and allows me to really back out and not be in their way. That you form that same type of relationship I was talking about with the sponsor of the organization. Now I'm hiring somebody to step behind me. They've got to have that same trust in me and me in them, that they can get it done without my intervention. I can't come tell the next person, here's, step 1, step 2, step 3, tell me when you're done and how you've done them and things along those lines. I've got to back up to the point that here are the outcomes and I trust you to accomplish it. And so that vetting process, again, is not just on their pedigree of training, but how do they approach things? How do we communicate as people? How do we process information when we get it in? If I'm very quick to make decisions and I'm working with somebody who takes longer to process or more information to process on the same topic, we need to know that and how we interact so that we can be effective. Otherwise, we're going to be disconnected and struggling just because of the conversational relationship, even though we're invested in the same outcome.
I think this is great, and we could go on a long time and further unpacking. I am curious, though, Russ, if you think a follow-up discussion might make sense, really around training an executive sponsor and how to be one. Is that worthy of its own session?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of people have an interest in being an executive sponsor, but we've never in the industry really done a good job of preparing people or helping them understand what it really means when you step into that role. And, on a small project, it's very forgiving or inconsequential if you make some missteps. But when you're talking about major investments that are really the life and death of an organization and a culture, having an effective sponsor is imperative. And we just have not done a good job of even defining what the term means. And I think that's true whether it's in government or private industry.
Thank you. Terry, I've sort of in the back of my mind while chatting with Russ, I just can't help but think about the environments you've been in beyond just state of California. Ford Motor Company, CIO, Department of Defense. I'm just curious what thoughts this prompts on best practice you've seen on executive sponsorship in these other environments before we transition to the next topic.
Well, I would add a couple of things that I think were inherent in what you and Scott were talking about, Russ was talking about. And the first one really is that sometimes people think executive sponsorship is executive oversight. And it isn't just oversight. It isn't just kind of watching things. To Russ's point, it's not just looking at project plans. So I think that there's a big distinction that executive sponsors have to recognize that it really means that investment that Russ was talking about. And the second thing is that he alluded to, but I want to bring out, is you're the person that makes really hard decisions that make people mad. And that is just a part of it. To get to the business outcomes, that Russ was describing, sometimes you have to choose one process over another process. And those are hard decision points. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation that you were both having. It really does relate to the specifics around what makes a successful executive sponsor and how then can that executive sponsor support the project director in the way that you were just talking.
So I'll add just a piece to that because I completely agree with what you said, Terry. They've got to make hard decisions, but they've also got to make them timely. In other words, you've got to be engaged enough in the project that you can't take that back and consider it for 2 or 3 weeks or a month and then come back with a decision. You've got really a whole group of people on the technology side, on the business side, working towards an objective. And it's got to be in the flow of when things come up. If we've got to educate a sponsor on really what the problem is, that means they weren't close enough to it in the first place. So they need to be engaged and willing to make that really hard decision. And Terry's 100% right. If you're not making some people mad, you're not doing the job very well. These are transformational efforts, and we should be pushing people out of their comfort zones. And that's hard to do sometimes. And some of the people you're upsetting are frankly people above you in the organization structure, whatever it is, that might be very attached to the way we've done things. But they should be trusting you to get to the outcome and empowering you to do that.
So, David, I don't know if that is similar to what you've seen, in the private sector, but I want to build on also something Russ said, is that actually then does impact the way that you look at building the team. The team itself is going to take cues from the project director and the support the project director gets from the executive sponsor. And David, you've done lots of work with teams. I mean, wouldn't you also say that it really does impact all the way down into those folks that are out there implementing?
It really does. And on the topic of teams, and it's been very consistent, we've seen across public companies, private equity-backed, nonprofit, and government, which is really a cascading effect. That relationship between the project director and executive sponsor, it cascades down. And, the team members know if they really have support from the top. And it allows them to move a lot more quickly. And I think it's a team effort on the higher end because it's difficult to assemble these teams. And sometimes the project director may identify some final candidates for a role. They need the executive sponsor to come in and help close the candidate to really show the commitment that the organization has. The work gets done at the team level, but foundationally, without the executive sponsor or project director, we find it's very difficult to hire.
Yeah. Russ, what's been your perspective and experience in terms of how it impacts your entire team?
So that culture that gets set, I agree with David, it cascades down from the top. But as you build that team, one of the things that I think it inhibits us in government, and I don't know if it's as strong in private industry, but we tend to build a duty statement that's got very square corners, and we put people in a box, and your expertise is this, you stay in your box. And it's really one of the things that one, we have to break down. The team has got to be responsible for the entire outcome, not just for their silo or their piece of it. I might be an engineering person or a training person. They've got to really be collaborating and getting towards that outcome. But the other thing is they've got to be empowered to cross boundaries. And as we build that team, we don't need a bunch of people of the same personality type or the same decision process. They've got to be able to challenge each other and have some of that natural conflict that gets us to a better outcome. But in doing that, they've got to be complementary to each other. And what I mean by that is not all the same. Really knowing the profiles and the way somebody makes a decision, the way they process information, the way they interact with each other. If you've got folks on your team that are more the introvert type, you've got to recognize that and pull them into conversations. And the same for folks that are more domineering in a conversation. It's not that one's more right or wrong than the other, but that's where the project director really needs to know that executive team, their strengths and weaknesses. And there are times when maybe your technical network person is actually your best public spokesperson, and your communications person is not. They help create the information, but the person actually presenting it might be in a completely different role. And that's okay. Play to the strengths and complement the weaknesses. And in that team, you need that mix that can depend on each other to fulfill those roles and not feel threatened by it. And that's often very hard. And in my experience in government, we end up getting into a lot of conversations around positions and definitions that are just a complete distraction from the outcome.
I love that, Russ. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to take time to get one piece of advice from each of you. We have folks in the audience that are either in the middle of a project or embarking on a project. So, David, let me start with you. What piece of advice would you give the audience as they're developing plans and thinking about their projects moving into the future?
Yeah, I think whether you're an executive sponsor or a project director, right now it's April 2022. And one of the biggest trends that we're finding is around bringing your stakeholders along. Okay? Look at your constituencies, look at the end users, look at everyone that may have a say. Get their inputs up front. Then the project director and executive sponsor can sit down and understand what's going on. Don't do it in a silo. Don't leave change management to the end. Bring it up front and get inputs from all constituencies. It's easier with technology than ever before. Surveys, meet with them, get the inputs from those stakeholders.
Fantastic, David. Thank you. And Russ, what advice would you have to your colleagues out there as they're embarking on many of the things that you've been through?
Well, I think coming out of the pandemic, we have a new sense of urgency and really opportunity. We have a lot of business areas of business that now we're able to see that we can use technology where maybe we didn't before because we assumed we would be in person. So there's a whole bunch of opportunity and urgency with that. But I think the recommendation that I would make is not to succumb to the urgency and jump in too deep, too fast. You've really got to assemble the right group of folks to get it done. And sometimes what you think is the right group isn't. And it's okay to make adjustments. It's okay to move people role to role or make adjustments in that team or realize that there's a gap that needs to be filled. And that takes budget authority. It takes, hiring and things along those lines. But that team is so important to getting to the outcome. I would say it's equally, if not a lot of times more important than knowing what are the requirements or the outcomes that we're trying to get to. Again, that team is the catalyst that will make it happen. So really having an empowered and strong team and continually investing in them and adjusting weaknesses, that's really one of the primary roles of the sponsor and the project director is to find anything that needs adjustment there.
Well, Ross, thank you. Well, I want to be respectful of our time commitment, so we'll have to wrap up here. In closing, I just can't thank Ross and David enough. I mean, there were so many insights in this half hour. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to capture all of them. I also want to thank our sponsor, Hyper, for making it possible to have this important webcast discussion today. And thanks to all of you in our audience for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.